Solomon was known as the gentlest soul at Pinewood Valley, a calm bull elephant who loved his keepers. But on a crisp October morning, the staff arrived to find a completely different animal. Solomon was backed into a corner, refusing food and issuing deep, thundering warning rumbles at anyone who dared approach. When the vet rushed to the scene and looked through their binoculars, they realized Solomon wasn't angry. He was protecting a secret. Clinging desperately to the massive gray giant was a tiny bobcat kitten, no bigger than a man's hand, pressed tight against the elephant's rough hide and trembling with fear. How did a tiny predator, barely 8 weeks old, end up stranded on a living mountain that could crush it with a single step? And why is Solomon shielding it from every human who tries to help? The reason will leave you speechless. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning sun rose golden and generous over the sprawling grounds of Pinewood Valley Wildlife Park, casting long amber streaks across the elephant habitat and warming the red clay paths that wound between enclosures. It was the kind of crisp October morning that made the Central Texas hill country feel like a postcard come to life. The sky a brilliant, unbroken blue, the air clean and carrying the earthy perfume of hay, sun-warmed dust, and the unmistakable musk of large animals beginning their day. Margaret Maggie Holloway had worked at Pinewood Valley for nearly 32 years, and mornings like this one still filled her with a quiet gratitude that never seemed to fade. At 63, with silver threading through her auburn hair and laugh lines mapping decades of joy around her eyes, she moved through her routines with the practiced ease of someone who had long ago stopped counting the hours she spent caring for the animals she loved. The elephant team was small but dedicated. Just Maggie, her colleague Frank Dawson, and their supervisor senior keeper Tom Bradley. And they operated with a wordless efficiency born of years working side by side. This morning, however, something was different. Maggie noticed it the moment she approached the main viewing area of the elephant habitat. Solomon, the park's beloved bull elephant, was not in his usual spot by the watering hole, where he typically greeted the dawn by spraying himself with cool water and rumbling contentedly at the keepers who waved to him from beyond the barrier. Instead, the massive creature stood near the far corner of the enclosure, his enormous gray body positioned oddly, almost defensively, against the rocky outcropping that bordered the habitat's eastern edge. "Tom?" Maggie called into her radio, her brow furrowing as she squinted against the bright morning light. "You seeing Solomon right now?" The radio crackled. "Just got eyes on him. He hasn't moved in about 20 minutes. That's not like him." It certainly wasn't. Solomon had been a fixture at Pinewood Valley for nearly 18 years, ever since he'd arrived as a young bull from a sanctuary in Tennessee that could no longer care for him. Now, in his mid-30s, he was known throughout the region for his remarkably gentle temperament. A calm, thoughtful presence who seemed to genuinely enjoy the company of his keepers and the curious visitors who came to admire him. He had never once displayed aggression toward staff, and his patience with the park's educational programs had made him something of an ambassador for his species. But this morning, Solomon was behaving like a different animal entirely. When Frank Dawson approached the habitat's service gate with Solomon's breakfast, a carefully prepared mix of Timothy hay, fresh vegetables, and specially formulated elephant pellets, the bull did something he had never done before. He turned his massive head toward Frank, extended his trunk in a clear warning gesture, and let out a low, rumbling vocalization that vibrated through the morning air like distant thunder. Frank stopped in his tracks, the bucket of produce hanging forgotten at his side. "Whoa," he breathed into his radio. "Whoa, whoa, whoa, something's wrong. He's telling me to back off." Maggie felt her heart begin to race. In 3 decades of working with elephants, she had learned to read their body language as fluently as any spoken language. And what she was seeing now sent a chill down her spine despite the warmth of the morning sun. Solomon's ears were slightly flared, his weight shifted back on his hindquarters, and his trunk moved in slow, deliberate arcs. All signs of an elephant who felt threatened or protective of something. But protective of what? Tom Bradley arrived at the viewing platform within minutes. His weathered face creased with concern beneath the brim of his worn Pinewood Valley cap. He'd been working with animals for over 4 decades, starting as a teenager mucking stalls at a county fair and working his way up through zoos and sanctuaries across the country. And he had seen his share of unusual animal behavior. But as he raised his binoculars to study Solomon more closely, even he felt a ripple of confusion. "He's not aggressive," Tom murmured, half to himself. "Look at his eyes. He's not angry. He's worried." Maggie stepped closer, shading her eyes against the brilliant morning light. Worried about what? For a long moment, no one could answer that question. Solomon remained in his defensive posture, his enormous body so still that he almost seemed carved from stone. The only movement was the gentle swaying of his trunk and the occasional flap of his ears as flies buzzed around him in the warming air. Then Frank, who had circled around to get a better angle from the maintenance path, suddenly let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a laugh. "Oh my God," he said, his voice cracking with disbelief. "There's something on his back. There's something on his back." Dr. James Whitfield was making his morning rounds in the veterinary clinic when the radio call came through. The park's head veterinarian for the past 11 years, James was a tall, lanky man in his early 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of calm, unflappable demeanor that made him perfectly suited for his work. He had treated everything from arthritic wolves to constipated tortoises, and very little surprised him anymore. This, however, surprised him. "Say that again," he said into the radio, certain he had misheard. "There's a bobcat kitten on Solomon's back," Tom repeated, his voice tight with a mixture of concern and amazement. "We don't know how it got there, but it's definitely there. And Solomon won't let anyone near him." James set down the chart he'd been reviewing and grabbed his medical kit. "I'm on my way." The walk from the veterinary clinic to the elephant habitat took less than 5 minutes, but by the time James arrived, a small crowd of staff members had already gathered at the viewing platform. Word traveled fast at Pinewood Valley, and the bizarre situation had drawn curious keepers from across the park, though Tom had been careful to keep the gathering quiet and controlled, not wanting to add to whatever stress Solomon might be feeling. James shouldered his way to the front of the group and raised his own binoculars, focusing on the massive gray shape standing sentinel in the far corner of the enclosure. For a moment, he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. There, pressed flat against the broad expanse of Solomon's back, was a tiny ball of spotted fur. A bobcat kitten. Couldn't have been more than 8 or 10 weeks old, James estimated, clinging to the elephant's rough gray hide with all the desperate determination its small body could muster. "How in the world?" James breathed. "We've been asking ourselves the same thing," Maggie said quietly beside him. "Best we can figure, it must have come from the bobcat habitat. There's only about 100 yards of wooded area between their enclosure and this one." James lowered the binoculars and turned to study the terrain. She was right. The bobcat habitat, home to a breeding pair and their most recent litter of kittens, was separated from the elephant enclosure by a stretch of native oak and juniper that the park had preserved as a natural buffer zone. The fencing between the areas was designed to contain the bobcats, but a kitten that small, especially one with an adventurous streak, It must have slipped through the mesh, James said slowly, piecing together the scenario in his mind. Found its way through the woods, somehow ended up at Solomon's enclosure, and then climbed up the only high ground it could find, Tom finished grimly. Probably thought he was a rock or a hill. The image would have been almost comical if it weren't so precarious. A bobcat kitten, weighing perhaps 3 or 4 pounds at most, stranded on the back of a 7-ton elephant, too frightened to climb down and too exhausted to do anything but cling on and hope for survival. And Solomon, gentle, patient, impossibly kind Solomon, had recognized the tiny creature's fear and responded with the only protection he could offer, the fortress of his own massive body. "Look at him," Maggie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He knows that little thing is terrified, and he's keeping everyone away until he's sure it's safe." James watched as Solomon's trunk curled slowly backward, reaching toward his own spine with a delicacy that seemed almost impossible for something so large. The tip of the trunk, as sensitive and precise as a human fingertip, brushed gently against the kitten's fur, and the tiny creature responded by pressing itself even closer to the elephant's back, clearly taking comfort from the touch. "That's the most remarkable thing I've ever seen," James said quietly. And he meant it. The next 2 hours unfolded with the careful, deliberate patience that only comes from working with wild animals. James knew that any sudden movement, any loud noise, any perceived threat could send the kitten scrambling in panic, and a panicked bobcat, even a tiny one, could easily injure itself or trigger a dangerous reaction from Solomon. Instead, the team worked slowly and methodically, their voices low and their movements gentle. First, they needed to clear the area of unnecessary observers. Tom quietly dispersed the gathered staff, asking them to return to their duties and promising updates as the situation developed. Then he posted Frank at the main path to redirect any early arriving visitors away from the elephant habitat, explaining only that there was a minor veterinary situation being addressed. Meanwhile, James and Maggie began the delicate process of acclimating Solomon to their presence. "Hey there, big guy," Maggie called softly, keeping her body relaxed and unthreatening as she approached the habitat's inner fence. "It's just me. Just Maggie. You know I'm not going to hurt you or your little friend." Solomon's ears flicked toward her voice, and for a moment, his trunk lowered slightly, a sign that he recognized her, that some part of him was willing to trust. But then his gaze shifted toward James, who was less familiar, and the trunk rose again in warning. "Easy," James murmured, stopping where he was and crouching low to make himself smaller. "Easy, Solomon. We're here to help." They stayed like that for nearly 40 minutes, Maggie speaking in a constant, soothing stream of words while James remained motionless and patient, letting Solomon's anxiety slowly drain away. The sun climbed higher in the brilliant blue sky, warming the enclosure and casting the scene in ever brighter light. But the tension in the air gradually began to soften. Finally, Solomon's trunk lowered completely. He let out a long, rumbling sigh that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet, and his massive head turned to look directly at Maggie with an expression that she would later swear was one of profound relief. "Help?" those ancient eyes seemed to say. "Please help the little one." Maggie felt tears prick at her own eyes as she keyed her radio. "Tom, I think he's ready. Bring the lift." The rescue itself was a masterpiece of coordination and care. Tom arrived with the hydraulic lift, a piece of equipment normally used for maintenance work on the habitat's high structures, and positioned it just outside the fence, far enough from Solomon that he wouldn't feel crowded. James climbed aboard, along with Sarah Mitchell, a young keeper from the Bobcat program who had been called over to help handle the kitten once they retrieved it. "Nice and slow," James reminded the lift operator, a steady-handed maintenance worker named Bill Hutchins who had been with the park for almost as long as Maggie. "We're not in any hurry." The lift rose inch by careful inch, bringing James and Sarah level with Solomon's back. From this vantage point, James could see the kitten clearly for the first time. A tiny, trembling ball of tawny fur with distinctive spotted markings and enormous golden eyes that stared up at him with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. "Hey there, little one," James said softly, keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. "You've had quite an adventure, haven't you?" The kitten mewled, a thin, reedy sound that pierced James's heart and pressed itself even flatter against Solomon's back. Its small claws, not yet fully developed, had found purchase in the elephant's thick, wrinkled hide, and it seemed determined not to let go. Solomon stood perfectly still, his trunk curling backward once more to offer a gentle reassurance to the kitten. The message was clear. "These are friends. It's okay." "I'm going to reach for you now," James told the kitten as if it could understand his words. Perhaps, on some level, it could understand his tone. "Nice and easy. You're safe. I promise you're safe." With movements as slow and deliberate as flowing honey, James extended his hands toward the tiny creature. The kitten's eyes widened, and for a heart-stopping moment, James thought it might bolt, might scramble up Solomon's neck or make a desperate leap toward the ground far below. But then Solomon's trunk brushed against it one final time, and something in the kitten seemed to relax. Its claws released their grip on the elephant's hide, and James was able to scoop the tiny body into his hands with a gentleness born of decades of experience. "Got you," he breathed, cradling the kitten against his chest. "I've got you." The kitten mewled again, but this time the sound was different. Less terrified, more exhausted. It nestled against the warmth of James's veterinary coat, its small body trembling with residual fear, but no longer frozen in survival mode. Below them, Solomon let out another deep rumble, and this time, Maggie would have sworn it sounded almost like relief. Back at the veterinary clinic, James conducted a thorough examination of their tiny patient while Sarah looked on and took notes. "Mild dehydration," James announced, gently checking the kitten's gums and skin elasticity. "Some minor scrapes on the paw pads, probably from climbing that fence. Signs of stress, obviously, but no serious injuries that I can see." Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "That's incredible. How long do you think it was up there?" James considered the question as he prepared a subcutaneous fluid treatment for the dehydration. Based on the footage Tom pulled from the security cameras, it looks like the kitten entered Solomon's enclosure sometime around 4:30 this morning. So roughly 5 hours. 5 hours, Sarah repeated, shaking her head in wonder. 5 hours on an elephant's back and it's basically fine. "Thanks to Solomon," James said quietly. If that elephant had panicked, had tried to shake it off, had done anything other than exactly what he did, this would be a very different story. The kitten, now wrapped in a warm towel and resting in a small recovery crate, blinked up at them with drowsy golden eyes. The fluids were already taking effect, and the tiny creature's trembling had finally begun to subside. "We should give it a name," Sarah said suddenly. "I know we don't usually name the wildlife cases, but this one feels different." James smiled, looking down at the small spotted face peering up at him. "Any suggestions?" Sarah thought for a moment, then grinned. "Loki," she said, "the trickster god. Because only a true little trickster could manage to get himself into and out of a situation like this." James laughed, the sound warm and genuine in the quiet of the clinic. "Loki it is." Word of the morning's extraordinary events spread quickly through the park, and by afternoon, the story of Solomon and Loki had become the only thing anyone could talk about. Keepers gathered in the break room to watch the security footage that Tom had compiled, marveling at the moment when the tiny kitten had appeared at the edge of Solomon's enclosure, scrambled through a gap in the secondary fencing, and made its fateful climb up what it must have believed was nothing more than a very large, very warm boulder. "There," Maggie said, pointing at the screen. "Right there." That's when Solomon realized something was on him. "Look at how he stops moving." The footage showed exactly what she described. Solomon, who had been slowly ambling toward his morning watering spot, suddenly froze mid-step. His trunk curled backward, probing at his own spine, and then, in a moment that made everyone watching catch their breath, the massive elephant carefully, deliberately lowered himself into a more stable stance, adjusting his posture so that the tiny creature clinging to his back would have a more secure perch. "He knew," Frank said, his voice hushed with amazement. "He knew from the very first second, and he just decided to protect it." "Elephants are incredibly intelligent," Tom reminded them, though his own voice was thick with emotion. "They have the largest brains of any land animal, and they're known for their empathy. There are documented cases of elephants trying to help other species in distress, even species that would normally be considered prey." "But a bobcat kitten," Sarah said, shaking her head. "That's not just intelligence, that's something else entirely." Maggie, who had worked with Solomon longer than anyone else on staff, smiled through the tears that had been threatening to fall all morning. "That's Solomon," she said simply. "That's who he's always been. The gentlest soul I've ever known." Later that afternoon, once Loki had been thoroughly examined and cleared for release, Sarah and 2 other keepers from the Bobcat program made the walk back to the cat habitat. The kitten, now bright-eyed and energetic after its fluid treatment and a small meal of specialized formula, rode in a secure carrier, its spotted face pressed against the mesh as it took in the passing scenery. The Bobcat habitat was a carefully designed naturalistic environment, featuring rocky outcroppings, native vegetation, and several large enclosures where the cats could exhibit their natural behaviors. Loki's mother, a beautiful female named Willow who had been hand-raised at the park after being orphaned as a kitten herself, was already pacing anxiously near the fence where she had last seen her wayward offspring. "Someone's been worried about you," Sarah murmured to Loki as they approached the enclosure. "Let's get you back to your mom, okay?" The reunion, when it came, was everything the watching staff could have hoped for. Willow rushed to her kitten the moment Sarah released it into the habitat, sniffing every inch of Loki's small body before scooping it up by the scruff and carrying it toward the safety of the den. The kitten went limp in its mother's grip, finally, completely surrendering to the protection it had been seeking all along. "Safe and sound," Sarah whispered, watching the pair disappear into the shadowed comfort of their rocky shelter. Finally safe and sound. As the golden light of late afternoon settled over Pinewood Valley, bathing the grounds in warm amber tones, Maggie made her way back to the elephant habitat for one final check on Solomon. She found him at his favorite spot by the watering hole, exactly where he should have been at this time of day. He was spraying himself contentedly, the water catching the light and scattering into rainbow droplets, his massive body relaxed and his ancient eyes peaceful. "You did good today, old friend," Maggie called to him softly. "You did so good." Solomon turned his head toward her voice, and for a moment, their eyes met across the distance. Then the great elephant lifted his trunk in what Maggie had always interpreted as a greeting, or perhaps today, an acknowledgement. "I did what needed to be done," that gesture seemed to say. Anyone would have done the same. But Maggie knew better. Not just anyone would have done the same. Not just any creature would have looked at a tiny, frightened stranger from an entirely different world and chosen protection over indifference, compassion over instinct. That was Solomon's gift. That was his grace. In the weeks that followed, the story of Solomon and Loki became something of a legend at Pinewood Valley Wildlife Park. Local news stations picked up the tale, and soon the heartwarming images of the elephant and the bobcat kitten were being shared across the country. Visitors came from miles away specifically to see Solomon, the gentle giant who had protected a baby wildcat with the same tenderness he might have shown to one of his own kind. But perhaps the most interesting discovery came from an unexpected source. During a routine discussion about enrichment programs, Susan Patterson, the park's senior curator, mentioned something that made everyone in the room stop and stare. "You know," Susan said casually, "we've been sharing elephant foot shavings with the cat department for years. It's fantastic sensory enrichment for the felines. They go absolutely crazy for the scent." "Foot shavings?" Sarah asked, confused. "What do you mean?" Susan explained. The thick, calloused pads and massive nails on elephants' feet naturally shed dry shavings as the animals walk and move. These shavings carry a strong, earthy odor that many carnivores, particularly cats of all sizes, find absolutely irresistible. For years, the elephant team had been collecting these shavings and sharing them with other departments as a form of natural enrichment. "We scatter them in the enclosures, hide them in puzzle feeders, that sort of thing," Susan continued. "The bobcats especially love them. They'll spend hours sniffing and rubbing and rolling in the stuff." Tom's eyes widened as the pieces suddenly fell into place. "The enrichment station," he said slowly. "We set one up near the fence line just last week, right near the gap where Loki got through." They pulled up the camera footage again, and this time they knew what to look for. Sure enough, just a few feet from the spot where Loki had squeezed through the secondary fencing, there was a small enrichment station containing, among other things, a scattering of elephant foot shavings. The footage showed Loki approaching the station in the pre-dawn darkness, his small nose twitching with interest. For nearly 15 minutes, the kitten sniffed and investigated the shavings with intense curiosity, rubbing his cheeks against them and pawing at them with obvious delight. Then, apparently following the scent trail, he began to wander, first toward the fence, then through the gap in the mesh, then deeper and deeper into the wooded buffer zone. "He was following the smell," Sarah breathed. "He loved the elephant scent so much that he followed it right into Solomon's enclosure." "And straight up onto Solomon's back," Tom finished, shaking his head in wonder, looking for the source of that amazing smell. The irony was not lost on anyone. An innocent attraction, a kitten's natural curiosity about an enticing scent, had led Loki into the most dangerous situation of his young life. And yet that same connection, that strange bridge between two species that should never have met, had ultimately led to his salvation. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning that reminded Maggie of that fateful October day, she stood at the edge of the elephant habitat and watched Solomon going about his morning routine. The sky was a brilliant blue. The air was clean and fragrant with new growth. And somewhere in the distance, she could hear the excited chatter of visitors beginning to fill the park. Loki, now a healthy and rambunctious young bobcat, was thriving in the habitat with his mother and siblings. He had grown into his spotted coat and his oversized paws, and the keepers reported that he was the most adventurous of the litter. Always the first to investigate new enrichment items, always the most curious about the world beyond his enclosure. They had stopped sharing elephant foot shavings with the bobcat habitat, of course. No one wanted to risk another fence-climbing expedition. But sometimes, when the wind was right, Sarah swore she could see Loki standing at the edge of his enclosure, his nose lifted toward the elephant habitat, as if remembering a scent and a protector from long ago. And sometimes, though perhaps this was just imagination, Solomon seemed to pause in his wanderings and turn his great head in the same direction, as if acknowledging a connection that defied all logic and expectation. A 7-ton elephant and a 4-pound kitten, a gentle giant and a tiny trickster, two creatures who should never have crossed paths, brought together by curiosity and chance, and something that could only be called grace. It was, Maggie thought, as the warm spring sunlight washed over her, the most beautiful story she had ever witnessed. And she was grateful every single day that she had been there to see it unfold. In the elephant's eye, there is a wisdom as old as the earth itself, a knowing that recognizes fear in all its forms and meets it not with aggression, but with patience and protection. In the end, it is not size or strength that defines true greatness. It is the choice, made in the quiet moments when no one is watching, to shelter the small and the frightened and the lost. That is the gift Solomon gave to Loki on that bright October morning. That is the gift he gives to all of us, every single day. And that, perhaps, is why we keep coming back to the animals, not just to watch them, but to learn from them. To remember what kindness looks like when it asks for nothing in return.